Two topics dominated the election: cost of living and crime. But there was another, climate, that was debated around the edges. But now a change of government could mean a raft of changes to climate and environmental policy, including big cuts to the Department of Conservation. CEO of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Dr. Kayla Kingdom-Bebb, is concerned. She joins me now. Thanks for coming in.
Morena.
Morena. Let's start with you. The decreasing biodiversity in our oceans is a big passion of yours. You've done a lot of work on that. Why is that?
That's true. Well, New Zealand has the 5th largest ocean territory on the planet, and it's home to upwards of 80% of our Indigenous biodiversity. It's an incredible treasure for the country. And we know our oceans are in trouble. I mean, you look outside in Tamaki Makaurau, at Tikapa Moana, we've seen the Hauraki Gulf in a sustained state of decline. Popular fishing spots all over are, going functionally extinct. And that's a real problem. So
the reason I ask about that is because you're at the Department of Conservation developing policy around those marine protection areas, weren't you? But fishing is a big industry for New Zealand. How do you balance that?
That's absolutely true. And, I think it's a common misconception that marine protected areas are bad for commercial and recreational fisheries. That is categorically incorrect. What we've seen over the last 2 decades is where you have large-scale, highly protected MPAs. They benefit commercial fisheries because they improve food security and they also improve our resilience to climate change.
So you think that the two work alongside of each other?
They can, and obviously inshore is another question. You would use inshore MPAs, ones closer to the coastline, for different reasons. And yes, of course, but we'd also say that recreational fishers see a halo effect usually from marine reserves.
Okay. The reason I'm going down this line is that because you've done a lot of work as a policy advisor in the Department of Conservation, but under the incoming government there are proposed cuts by National. It wants to cut 6.5% out of the public service, and it highlighted the Department of Conservation as a place for savings. So you only recently left DOC. Is it bloated?
It is not. When the department was founded in 1987, since that time it's been chronically underfunded. The Department of Conservation's mandate is immense. It manages 1/3 of the country, not to mention a huge portion of our marine territory, for less than 1% of GDP. And it's been doing it for the last 35 years in the smell of an oily rag. I think I would also note...
Can you argue that it's the smell of an oily rag when its budget's gone up 85% since 2017?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the department is facing a number of threats, and its mandate is not just around protecting our threatened biodiversity. It's also critical to driving tourism. I mean, prior to COVID, international tourism was New Zealand's biggest export, and people come to this country to see our outstanding wild landscapes and our unique biodiversity. And DOC has a very important role in ensuring that can continue.
But DOC's budget is the biggest it's ever been, about $880 million at the moment. You point out that tourism is a massive earner. Is that not enough to cope with the tourism influx and preserve that biodiversity and that sort of, green New Zealand image?
Look, if you look at the state of biodiversity across the board in Aotearoa, it's declining. And that's on public conservation lands, and it's off of it. On a good year, not a massed year when you have a superabundance of beach seed, the department's able to do sustained predator control on around 2% of PCL. 2%.
What's PCL?
Oh, public conservation lands.
Okay, yeah.
So 2% of the conservation estate. We are lucky that more of our species are not functionally extinct in some of those areas.
So if these cuts go through, 6.5%, say, off DOC's budget, what does that mean?
That's a great question. I mean, this year the department is already expected to go into a lower baseline because the big investment out of budget 2018 is coming to a close.
Right, so you're talking about like the Jobs for Nature Fund and things like that, they're all coming to a close?
Also the big investment that happened in budget 2018.
Okay. Oh, okay.
But, my understanding is that projections are, in the year, financial year 2025, DOC's going to be looking at an $85 million structural deficit. That's enormous. The department can't sustain another 6.5% on top of that, especially when they're being asked to run another Great Walk. Great Walks do not make DOC money. They are loss leaders.
Okay. What did you think of the way that climate in general was debated during the election, or not?
To be honest, I was astonished at how silent people were on the debate. I mean, we've seen the most expensive natural disaster in New Zealand's history this year with Cyclone Gabrielle. There was incredible, tragic loss of life and homes and livelihoods through regional flooding into Taitokoro and Tairāwhiti and Tamaki Makaurau. This was supposed to be a climate election. And
what happened?
Well, I mean, short-term pressures around cost of living are more politically sellable, I suppose. But what is really concerning to me, actually, is that the kind of commitments that have been made by the major parties around climate have not been backed up by substantive policy commitments.
Oh, I just want to talk about that in a sec, but let's just go back to the election. Sure, cost of living and crime sort of dominated as the issues, and surveys showed that they were number 1 and 2, and climate was like number 7. Is that like a failure on behalf of lobby groups to get climate into people's, the forefront of people's concerns?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, climate change, I think New Zealanders realise that climate change is here this year, and unfortunately it had to take a pretty significant natural disaster for us to realise that.
And yet it still didn't really feature in the election despite that.
Yep. Well, I guess when people are having trouble putting food on the table and paying their bills, you can understand they might be focused on more near-term pressures. But it's also the role of our political leaders to be brave enough to make those calls that are going to foster long-term intergenerational equity. The cost that we are putting on the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren and even our future selves by failing to address climate change and biodiversity loss is just incredible. It's actually morally reprehensible.
How can you get the message through that the cost of climate change is a cost of living expense? Because that doesn't seem to be resonating.
I think in the coming years, we will see that it does, because this country can't sustain natural disaster after natural disaster and not have that cost flow through to people's everyday lives.
Well, let's look at some of the specific policies of a potential government. Well, we don't have one yet, but we know what their policies are. Money raised from the emissions trading scheme under National will in part be returned for tax relief. So that's a market-driven approach to climate change. Will that work?
I wouldn't describe it as a market-driven approach, to be honest. Calling that policy approach a climate dividend is factually incorrect and actually incredibly misleading. A climate dividend is when you have revenues from the ETS directly transferred to ordinary citizens, and it should be pegged to the carbon price. What is being proposed here is defunding New Zealand's emissions reduction work programme to fill government coffers to underwrite tax cuts. It's not the same thing.
The argument is that the targeted approach previously with ETS funding going into mitigation of climate change hasn't actually reduced emissions that much. Do you accept that?
I do not, because since 1990, New Zealand's emissions overall have been up 19%. But in the last 3 years, even putting aside the effect of the pandemic, they've come down. And I think it's fair to say that the structure created by the Zero Carbon Act and our emissions reduction plan is actually working. And we know internationally that decarbonisation is slow to get going, but once it gets going, it increases its speed exponentially.
Okay, so New Zealand is doing its bit, and this is where the ACT Party argues that we can only do our bit. We can't go beyond that, and why should we lead the pack?
Well, I think they're arguing that we shouldn't be doing our bit, actually, because they're proposing to repeal the Zero Carbon Act and fix our carbon price to our 5 major trading partners. That's not doing our bit. That's potentially relitigating our Paris commitments.
Are you saying not living up to our Paris commitments?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And that would be hugely problematic.
OK, but emissions are coming down. So the situation at the moment, New Zealand is doing its bit, right?
Yes, but will we be able to continue doing our bit if we completely defund our emissions reduction work programme? I'd argue probably not.
ACT is saying that it wants to get rid of the Climate Change Commission and all the ancillary bits and pieces around that, including the Zero Carbon Act. Do you believe that that will be catastrophic for our sort of climate goals?
I do. The ETS is not fit for purpose at the moment. The ETS, the emissions trading scheme, was designed to meet the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, not Paris. If you were to redesign the emission trading scheme today, it would look a lot different. You wouldn't be incentivizing widespread exotic pine plantations, for example. You might be looking at other novel forms of removals. OK. The outgoing government didn't have a climate change minister in Cabinet. They didn't have a conservation minister in Cabinet. What would you like to see in the new government? Well, I think it's really important to have, your climate minister within Cabinet. It's an economic portfolio as much as it is an environmental one. But I'd also argue that, the policies relevant to climate change and New Zealand's climate action are not just climate portfolio policies. Our transport policies are climate policies. Our housing policies are climate policies. Our environmental policies are climate policies. There needs to be good integration across government. The ERP, the Emissions Reduction Plan, was a great step in the direction of achieving that. For the public service agencies involved in it, it was a fairly excruciating process. But what I know internationally, because WWF is active in over 100 countries, is that our experience actually puts us ahead of the pack. We're relatively well coordinated across government now, and now is the time to keep the foot on the accelerator. So what do you think of New Zealand's political leadership when it comes to climate change? I'm concerned. And the reason I'm most concerned about this is, the National Party went out and said they are meeting New Zealand's international commitments as a bottom line, and I think that's excellent. but they've not backed it up with any substantive policy commitments, like quite the opposite. We've been obsessed with fiscal holes in this election, right? We've been talking about holes in the tax plan, etc. But if we're going to defund the Climate Emergency Response Fund by $2.3 billion, you're going to cut the clean car rebate, which is arguably the most effective transport policy we've seen in the last 10 years, and you're going to explore offshore oil and gas. I'd like to know how we're going to meet those commitments. It's not a fiscal hole, it's a fiscal abyss.
And on that point, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Kayla Kingdom-Webb, CEO of WWF New Zealand. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.